When aliens begged for aid, Deathworlders arrived with a fleet of wrath. The colony world of Valos Iron was already gone before the last distress signal reached Valori Prime. The orbital defense grid had held for 14 minutes against 300 craft. Warships, vessels that did not pause, did not negotiate, and did not turn back. The Valori ship stationed there had been the finest in the conclave. Fleet, elegant, powerful, centuries of engineering poured into every hull. They had lasted roughly as long as glass held against a hammer. High Diplomat Saralandon stood at the center of the emergency chamber on Valori Prime and watched the final transmission feed from Valos Iron cut to static. Around her, 30 representatives of the conclave were on their feet, voices overlapping, everyone speaking, and no one listening. She let them run. She had already done the calculations. There was no combination of conclave resources that stopped what was coming. She had checked the numbers 6 different ways and arrived at the same answer every time. 3 systems lost, 4 billion people gone, not conquered, not enslaved, gone. The craft Dominion did not want territory, they did not want resources, or prisoners, or tribute. And GT snorts. And GT, they wanted the galaxy to contain exactly one form of complex life, and they were working through the list with terrifying efficiency. Their declaration at the start of the war had been 8 words: there is room in this galaxy for one. Saralandon raised one hand. The room went quiet. We have exhausted every option, she said. Her voice was calm. That calmness frightened the people around her more than any outburst would have. Every treaty, every deterrent, every weapon, an alliance we have built over 3,000 years of conclave history has been tested against the craft and found wanting. The numbers do not favor us. They will not become favorable on their own. She paused. There is one choice we have not yet made. Ambassador Kethoran of the Lyri rose from his seat. He was tall, silver-skinned, and already furious at where the conversation was heading. If you are about to suggest what I believe you are suggesting, I am suggesting we contact humanity, she said. The chamber erupted. She waited. They are primitive, Kethoran said loudly over the noise. They have been a spacefaring species for 60 years. 60, we have star charts older than their entire written history. They are emotional and impulsive, and they have spent most of their existence in conflict with each other over the smallest disagreements. Why would we trust our survival to? They stopped, she said flatly. They ended their internal conflicts and unified, and the reason they were able to do that is the very reason I am standing here making this proposal. She pressed a control on the table. Single intelligence file appeared on every screen in the chamber. It had been compiled by a conclave observer assigned to monitor human space 7 years prior. Most of it was routine data: population counts, technological assessments, trade projections. But the final section was a personal note buried at the end and never formally flagged or escalated. Saralandon had found it 3 days ago in a low-priority archive, and she had not slept properly since. The room read it in silence. The note read, I made the initial error of classifying humans as prey animals that had acquired technology. After 11 months of direct observation, I have corrected that assumption entirely. They do not push outward into space from simple curiosity. Something in their fundamental nature refuses to allow them to stop moving forward. They spent 200,000 years in direct competition with a world that seemed designed to destroy everything that lived on it. They did not merely survive that world. They dominated it. Every large creature on their planet either serves them or avoids them. They carry that history in their instincts and their reflexes, in the way they design and build things. They over-engineer everything. Their ships have more redundancy systems than any vessel I have ever studied from a conclave species. Their soldiers train specifically for failure as much as for success. I am updating my threat classification from primitive isolate to unknown potential. Final recommendation: do not mistake their current peace for softness. It is not softness, it is patience. There is a very significant difference between the two. The chamber was very still. Saralyn let the silence hold for a long moment. Then she said, "The craft Dominion has never encountered a death world species. They have never faced something that did not evolve under safe and stable conditions. Every species in this conclave, including mine, reached civilization by building shelter from the dangers of the universe. Humans reached civilization by deciding they were the most dangerous thing in theirs." She looked across every face in the room. "I am opening a channel to. So, if anyone here has a stronger option, I am listening." The room stayed silent. She opened the channel. The signal traveled 11 hours through the relay network. It arrived at Earth's Unified Terran Admiralty building at 3:17 in the morning local time. The duty officer who received it read. The header sat very still for a moment, and then moved quickly up the chain of command. 14 minutes later, Admiral Helen Ward was at her desk in full uniform. She was 54 years old, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, the kind of person who generated stillness in every room she entered. The glow of her screen lit her face as she read the Valerium message once, then again, then a third time. Outside her office window, the city of New Geneva moved quietly in the dark. Before dawn, the lights of the orbital elevator stretched upward into a black sky like a single thread connecting the ground to everything that lay beyond it. She set the message down. She was still for 30 seconds. Then she opened the emergency fleet channel and spoke 4 words that had not been said in 40 years. "Activate contingency wrath." The Admiralty building had 43 floors. Within 20 minutes of those 4 words, every floor was lit. Word moved fast in military channels. Helen Ward had not issued a general alert or a public broadcast. She had spoken 4 words into a specific encrypted frequency that very few people even knew existed, and yet by the time she walked from her office down to the command floor, she passed 17 officers already at their stations, pulling up feeds and access codes for systems that had sat dormant for a generation. Nobody looked surprised. That was the thing about contingency wrath. Every officer in the Terran Admiralty knew it existed. They briefed it during training. They updated it in quiet reviews every few years. They never discussed it in casual conversation. It sat in the background of the entire military structure like a locked door that everyone knew was there and everyone hoped would never need to be opened. Helen Ward pressed her palm to the command terminal and the door opened. The first feeds that came up were the Shipyards around Jupiter. The great ring structures had been running on low-power maintenance cycles for 11 years, producing commercial haulers and survey vessels and the occasional patrol frigate. In the 11 minutes since the activation code had gone through, every fabrication arm had already shifted to new configurations. The schematics on the screen were not for haulers. Captain Owen Clark, her chief of fleet operations, appeared at her shoulder. He was 41, lean and precise, and he had been in the Admiralty long enough to understand exactly what the Jupiter feeds meant. Full wartime production, he said. It was not a question. Full wartime production, she confirmed. He exhaled slowly. How long do we have before the next Valori system falls? The Conclave has been losing a system every 2 weeks, she said. We move as fast as we can, and we do not stop moving. He pulled up the fleet roster. His expression changed. The roster for the first Terran Expeditionary Armada had been updated automatically in response to the activation, and it currently listed 4,400 warships. That number included vessels held in long-term storage, crews on reserve status, and a dozen ship classes that the civilian population had never heard of because they had simply never been needed before. Where are we getting all the crews? He asked. Cryo battalions, she said. The thaw cycle started 8 minutes ago. He went quiet. Helen Ward turned to the main display, where a map of human-controlled space filled the wall from floor to ceiling. She studied it the way a surgeon studies a patient before the first incision. Focus, certain, entirely without hesitation. Across human space, things were waking up. On the colony world of Hardin's Point, an industrial plant that had been producing agricultural equipment for 6 years received a coded signal at 3:42 in the morning. By 4:15, the factory floor had reorganized and was running new templates. The plant manager, a woman named Grace Alderman, stood at the edge of the floor and watched her machines begin producing components she had never seen before, following blueprints stored in a sealed partition of the facility system since the day it was built. She had always known those blueprints were there. Everyone who ran a major industrial facility knew you kept them updated and you hoped you would never need them. She was no longer hopping in the asteroid belt near Saturn. Maintenance crew of 9 aboard a deep storage depot received the same signal. Their depot contained 312 warships, sealed in cold storage, darkened and waiting in the deep quiet, each one fully armed and fueled. Sergeant Ben Marsh, who had been crew chief on that depot for 4 years and had never once opened Bay 7, the lights inside came on in sequence. The ships were exactly as the manifests described. Every single one. The youngest crew member, a woman named Kate Flynn, who had been assigned to the depot 8 months earlier and had never stood near a warship, stepped forward to the edge of the bay and looked along the row of vessels stretching into the dark. Are they all like this? She asked. Ben looked at the ships. Every depot, he said, every ring yard, every reserve station. She was quiet for a moment. We were always ready. Yes, he said simply, we were always ready. In Wellington, the cryo units in the Terran Shock Corps Reserve Facility began their thaw cycles. Row after row of chambers warmed through their sequences in order. Inside each one, soldiers who had been sleeping in medically maintained stasis for years began to breathe on their own again. The first one to fully wake was a tall man named Gary Holt, a corporal in the 14th Shock Battalion who had gone into stasis at the end of the Drava Brushfire conflict and had been under for 9 years and 4 months. He sat up in his chamber. A medical technician handed him something warm to drink. How long? Gary asked. 9 years, 4 months, the tech said. Gary nodded as if he had been told about a mild delay in transit. He drank from the cup. What is the situation? The tech told him. Gary set the cup down. He was quiet for just a moment. Then he stood, located his assigned equipment locker, and began to dress. Around him, hundreds of other soldiers were doing the same thing, all of them moving with the unhurried focus of people whose training had long since become instinct. Back on Vellery Prime, a young Vellery liaison officer named Thess received word that a seat had been arranged for him aboard the UTS Unyielding flagship of the 1st Terran Expeditionary Armada. His superior handed him the assignment brief and gave him a long look that carried many things without saying any of them aloud. Thess had read everything available on humans. He had studied their history, their biology, their cultural records. He believed he was prepared. He arrived at the Unyielding's docking port 72 hours after the activation signal had gone out and walked into a corridor that smelled of machine oil and something chemical he could not immediately name. The crew around him moved at a pace that felt almost aggressive. No one was running, but every single person was moving with a purpose so concentrated it was nearly visible. A human officer named Nora Blake met him at the entrance and walked him toward the observation deck without slowing her stride. We launch in 4 hours, she said. I thought the fleet was still assembling, he said. It finished assembling 40 minutes ago. He stopped walking. She stopped with him politely and waited. 4,400 ships, he said, assembled in 72 hours. 71, she said. There was nothing in her voice that sounded like pride. It simply sounded like a fact. Thess started walking again. He passed a viewport and looked out at the fleet. Arranged in the dark, ships of every class in perfect formation, lit up, ready, stretching across his field of view further than he could comfortably measure. He felt something move through him that his people did not have an easy word for. The closest match he found in the human language database was awe. He noted it and kept walking. Ethan Prime had never been a military world. It was a logistics hub chosen for the current war effort because of its position at the center of the Conclave's defensive grid. Its population of 300 million had been partially evacuated. Those who remained moved in the quiet, muted state of people who had been living in the edge of disaster long enough to stop reacting to it with urgency and had begun simply enduring it. Admiral Counselor Velthon, who commanded what remained of the Conclave fleet, was reviewing a fresh casualty report in the deep-level command center of the Planetary Administration building. When the alert came in, the human fleet had arrived in the system. He looked at the screen. He looked at it for a long time. All of them, he asked. All of them, his aide confirmed. Quietly, Velthon walked to the observation deck. Through the reinforced viewport, he watched the human fleet enter orbit, and he did not speak for several minutes. He had known the numbers. He had read 4,400 ships in the briefing and processed it. The way he processed all figures, with the detachment of a commander who had seen a great deal of war. Seeing it was not the same as reading it. The ships were not elegant, that was the first thing he registered. Valori warships were built with an aesthetic care that reflected thousands of years of civilized tradition, smooth hull, lines, curved forms, a visual language that communicated restraint and purpose. Human warships looked as if someone had identified the essential function of a weapon, removed everything that was not that function, and launched it into space. They were angular and dense, their surfaces covered almost entirely in weapons ports and sensor arrays. Many of the hulls carried old damage, repaired, but not hidden, left visible like a record of every conflict each ship had passed through. Some of the hulls had artwork painted on them. Velthon leaned slightly forward to confirm what he was seeing. Yes, painted directly on the warship hulls, large, bold images in human visual styles, personal and expressive. He would learn later that this was a tradition spanning centuries, that human crews had painted their vessels since the era of wooden ships on their homeworld's oceans, long before they ever reached space. He was still considering this when the unyielding docked and Admiral Helen Ward stepped onto Ethan Prime. She arrived with a small staff and no ceremony. She offered the Valori greeting gesture, declined the formal welcome address that had been prepared, and asked directly for the war room. The council members around Velthon adjusted their pace to match hers. They were accustomed to proceedings with specific rhythms, formal openings, structured acknowledgments, the careful architecture of diplomatic encounter. She moved through all of it at the speed of someone with a great deal to do. In the war room, she listened to the full Valori defensive strategy without interrupting once. Thess, observing from a position near the back of the room, watched her take it in. She listened well. She asked precise questions at the exact moments that mattered. When the presentation concluded, she was quiet for the length of time it took to think through what she had heard. Then she said, "You are fighting a defensive war." Velthon confirmed that they were. "That ends today," she said. "A defensive war against an enemy that does not negotiate and does not retreat is not a strategy. It is a delay. I am not here to help delay your losses. I am here to end this." Velthon studied her. He said carefully, "You proposing an offensive campaign with a force that has just arrived against an enemy that has not been turned back once in this entire war." "I am proposing we turn them back," she said, "starting in 48 hours. The council exchanged looks across the table. Thess watched their expressions and understood what was passing between them. They were deciding whether to trust her. He had spent 3 days aboard the Unyielding before coming here, and he could have told them something useful. The question of trust was secondary. The capability was already present, whether or not anyone in the room chose to believe in it. The engagement was scheduled. The meeting ended. As the chamber emptied, a young human officer named Owen Clark from the Admiral's staff noticed Thess standing near the door and walked over. First time working alongside humans? Owen asked. Yes, Thess said. Owen nodded unbothered. How are you finding it so far? Loud, Thess said honestly. Owen smiled. It was a wide open expression that would have seemed undignified in Valori social custom, but here it simply seemed natural, the way all human expressions seemed unguarded and quick, as if they cost nothing. Yeah, we tend to be, he said. You get used to it. 2 days later, the Battle of the Ethan Corridor began. The craft Dominion sent a purgation fleet of 2,000 ships, the same configuration they had used to remove every Valori system they had taken. They moved in standard formation, broadcasting their standard 8-word signal as they advanced, confident in a formula that had not yet failed them. They did not receive the expected response. The first Terran Expeditionary Armada came out to meet them. Thess watched the engagement from the Unyielding's observation deck. He had studied naval combat in academic terms. He had read accounts of the 3 smaller conflicts humans had engaged in during their 60 years in space. He had reviewed technical specifications of their warships in detail. None of it had prepared him for this. Human ships took direct hits from craft weapons and kept their course, not because the hits failed to cause damage. They clearly did. Entire whole sections were breached, power systems failed visibly on his monitoring feed, but within minutes crews sealed the breaches, rerouted the power, brought weapons back online and pressed the engagement forward. The redundancy was not just built into the ships, it was built into the people. They trained for broken systems the way other species trained for optimal conditions. They were skilled at fighting damaged, and they were extraordinary at it. The Krath fleet, which had never encountered sustained resistance of this kind, began shifting its formations. They adapted. The human commanders adapted faster, and they did it individually, each ship's commander making decisions in the moment without waiting for a central order, improvising in ways that the Krath hive logic could not predict, because no model based on collective behavior could anticipate the decisions of thousands of separate minds operating on instinct and experience. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, the Krath purgation fleet was gone. Thess checked the sensor data twice to be certain he was reading it correctly. Not retreated, gone. On Ethan Prime, in the shelter levels, where the civilian population had been waiting, people came out into open air. For the first time in weeks, some of them simply stood in place and looked up at the sky. Thace returned to his quarters on the Unyielding and sat down in front of his communication terminal. He had been trained in formal reporting language. He knew how to document engagements in precise technical terms, but there was something about what he had witnessed today that technical language could not capture, and he sat in front of a blank screen for a long time before he found a way to begin. He wrote, "I watched a death world species fight today." I had read that phrase many times in preparation for this assignment. I did not understand what it meant until now. I will do my best to explain. He wrote without stopping for nearly 2 hours. The war changed after the Ethan Corridor. Not suddenly, not with announcements or displays of celebration. It changed the way a tide changes, not a single wave, but a slow, steady shift in weight. Before Ethan, the Valori War Council had been fighting to hold whatever remained. After it, Helen Ward spent 4 hours with Velthon going over maps in force, projections, and by the end of that meeting, the council had a different kind of plan, not a line to hold, a direction to move. The Craft Dominion's collective consciousness, what Terran intelligence analysts had designated the Nexus, was not located in any single place. It was distributed across a network of core ships and fixed installations spread through the far reaches of Krath territory, each node connected to the others in a continuous signal that kept the Dominion unified and coordinated. Across hundreds of light years, remove 1 node and the signal rerouted, remove 10 and the network barely registered it. But Terran analysts had been studying craft communication patterns since the first engagement, and they had found something the Velori had not looked for. The signal was not uniform, it pulsed from 7 specific points with significantly greater strength than anywhere else in the network. Helen Ward showed the projection to Velthon. That is the craft heartbeat. She said, we cut it and the Dominion loses coordination. We remove it entirely and the Dominion loses cohesion. Velthon studied the map. That cluster is deep inside craft territory. To reach it, we would need to push through 4 defensive belts. Yes, she said. Our combined forces are not sufficient for an operation of that scale. The 2nd and 3rd Armadas are currently at the assembly point, she said. They are waiting on my signal. He looked at her. You held 2 additional armadas in reserve. I plan for a longer war, she said. I am hoping it will not be one. The order went out. Thess, now embedded with a Terran shock core ground unit on the liberated Velori world of Selvaruth, received the news. Along with the rest of the unit, he was in the ruins of what had been a civilian market district, helping Sergeant Lena Price direct supply deliveries to displaced residents. When the word came through, Lena read the signal, folded it away, and went back to moving supply crates. Does it change anything here? Thess asked. Not yet, she said. Still work to do. Here first. She was 29 years old. She had the practical, unhurried manner of someone who had learned to focus entirely on what was immediately in front of her, because the larger picture had too many variables to be useful at ground level. She had also, earlier that same morning, personally carried 4 Velori children out of a collapsed structure while the rest of her squad managed the outer area. She had not mentioned it. Afterward, neither had anyone else. It had simply been something that happened and then been set aside because there was more to do. Thess had been noting these qualities in his reports home and struggling to explain them. Humans were the most capable soldiers he had ever observed. They were also in the spaces between operations, relentlessly warm in a way that seemed almost effortless, as if their compassion required no management and was therefore spent freely in every direction. He had been trying to reconcile these two things as opposing characteristics and finding that the reconciliation would not hold. They were not opposing. They were the same quality expressed in different situations. Both of them came from the same source. A deep, apparently inborn refusal to accept that anything in front of them was beyond helping. 3 weeks into the three-front offensive, the Craft Dominion made the decision that changed the nature of the war. They targeted Meridian Meridian was a human colony world. Second-generation settlement. Approximately 800,000 residents. Overwhelmingly civilian. It had no strategic value in the current campaign. The craft targeted it because it was human and because it was reachable, and they brought the same total efficiency to it that they brought to every operation. 800,000 people. The news reached the unyielding 14 minutes after it happened. Thess was in the common area when the announcement came through. He watched the human crew receive it carefully because he had been observing human responses to difficult news for weeks, and he expected some form of visible distress, the kind of open, immediate reaction that would accompany news of this magnitude in Vellery culture. What he saw was silence. Not the silence of shock or incomprehension. It was a different quality entirely. The room went quiet in a way that felt like weight rather than emptiness, and one by one the crew members set down what they were holding, stared at nothing for a moment, and then returned to what they had been doing. They continued quietly with an expression on their faces that Thess did not have an immediate word for. He wrote home that evening, "I am not certain how to describe what I witnessed today. I believe it was grief, but human. Grief does not present the way Vellery grief does. It does not come outward. It goes inward and becomes something else. I do not yet have a name for what it becomes. I will continue watching." Within 48 hours, Helen Ward had doubled the offensive. Every resource held in secondary reserve was committed, every ship awaiting orders received new ones. The campaign pace, already aggressive by any standard the Vellery had ever observed, accelerated in a way that the Council's logistics team struggled to track. Velthan requested a meeting. He wanted to discuss pace, supply lines, and the risks of moving too fast. He was a careful commander, and these were reasonable concerns. Helen Ward listened to every one of them. Then she said, "Meridian had 800,000 people." He nodded. He understood the weight of it. "We are going to the Nexus," she said. "Not when the conditions are ideal, not when the risk assessment is comfortable. We are going now." He did not argue further. He had watched her work for weeks. He had seen her make one minor miscalculation and correct it within minutes, and he had seen her be right about everything else. More than that, he had come to understand that her speed was not impulsiveness. Every fast decision she made was built on preparation that had been quietly in place for years, waiting for exactly this kind of moment. She had not become ready when the war started. She had been ready long before anyone called. Deep in Krath territory, the Dominion's hive mind processed the new data as the Terran campaign intensified. It ran projections. It modeled outcomes. It adjusted formations and signal patterns with the cold precision of a consciousness that had never experienced doubt or hesitation. And then, for the first time in the entire recorded history of the Krath Dominion, the Snort's projections began returning an answer the hive mind did not have a prepared category for. Not a small probability of failure, not an acceptable loss ratio, something Snorts else entirely, something the Dominion's collective intelligence had genuinely never encountered in any engagement it had ever modeled. An opponent it could not calculate. The Nexus cluster occupied a system of 7 collapsed stars at the far edge of Krath territory. It had never been mapped in detail by any conclave species. The craft had maintained it in perfect secrecy for centuries, a deep and silent core at the center of their distributed consciousness. Thousands of core ships moved through that system in slow, continuous rotation, their signals interlocking in a pattern that kept the Dominion unified and coherent across hundreds of light years of space. The combined Terran armadas arrived at the outer edge of the system on the morning of the 51st day of the campaign. Thess was on the Unyielding's observation deck when the fleet came out of its transit sequence. He had been there for 2 hours already. Unable to rest, he stood at the viewport and watched ship after ship emerge, each one falling into formation with quiet precision, and the sight of them assembled together, 12,000 vessels, 3 armadas moving as one, was something he understood immediately he would carry for the rest of his life. Helen Ward was on the command deck. He could hear her voice distantly through the corridor, steady, unhurried, issuing orders with no more visible tension in her tone than if she were directing a routine exercise. The crew responded with the same calibrated focus. He had stopped finding this remarkable. Weeks ago, he had come to understand it. Humans did not remove fear in situations like this. They placed it somewhere it could not touch the work that needed to be done, and they kept it there by habit and by choice. Before the engagement began, something happened that no one in the conclave had anticipated. The craft Dominion sent a signal. It was the first time in the entire war that the craft had initiated any communication beyond their opening declaration. The message came in on a broadband frequency and was received simultaneously by every ship in the combined fleet. Thess read it on the display in his section and felt a shift in the room around him, a held-still quality that spread through the ship in seconds. The craft were offering terms, not surrender in any traditional sense. The hive mind had no framework for that concept, but they offering something that functioned as a ceasefire, a permanent halt to their expansion, a full withdrawal from every Vellery system they had taken, and beyond that, something extraordinary. They were offering data, centuries of accumulated knowledge, scientific records, biological surveys, star charts covering territory no conclave species had ever reached. By any reasonable measure, it was an enormous offer. Thess read it twice. He looked up and found Lieutenant Nora Blake nearby, watching him with an expression he recognized now as the human form of careful restraint. "What do you think she will say?" he asked. Nora was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You know what happened at Meridian?" He did. Helen Ward's response was transmitted 40 seconds after the craft message arrived. It was 3 words sent on the same broadband frequency, received by every ship in the fleet and every connected point in the craft Dominion at the same moment. "You targeted Meridian." That was all. No conditions, no counteroffer, no ultimatum with terms attached. 3 words that contained everything they needed to contain and nothing else. The engagement began. What followed lasted 9 days. Thess would later attempt to describe it in formal terms and find that formal terms were insufficient. He could capture individual moments. Gary Holt and his damage control crew sealing 3 successive hull breaches on the Unyielding while the ship continued its approach. The work done with a focused calm that seemed to come from somewhere very deep in their training. The way human commanders across the fleet adjusted their tactics in real time, hour after hour, each one acting on their own judgment, creating an overall pattern of movement that the craft hive logic could not model because it had no framework for thousands of individual minds making independent decisions simultaneously. The way the crew of the Unyielding laid on the second night began singing together over an open internal channel old songs that this did not recognize, with rhythms that seemed to say, quietly, and without any performance, that whatever was happening outside the hull, the people inside were present, intact, and together. On the sixth day, the first craft core ship fell silent. On the seventh, 4 more. On the eighth, the outer signal of the nexus began to fragment. Sections of the hive consciousness lost their connections as the core ships anchoring them were one by one removed from the network. Craft formations that had moved in perfect coordination began showing gaps. Individual ships started acting in ways that contradicted the ships beside them. The Snort's hive's instructions failing to reach them cleanly through a network that was losing its foundation. On the 9th day, the Nexus cluster went silent. The hive mind of the craft Dominion had not experienced silence in over 3,000 years of continuous existence. Without the signal that had defined and organized it, it simply ceased to function as a single entity. Individual ships stopped moving. Formations dissolved across the entire front simultaneously and without drama, like a fire that had run out of everything it needed to keep burning. The war ended not with a final dramatic strike or a great charge forward, but with the quiet of a signal that no longer came. Helen Ward stood at the viewport of the Unyielding's command deck for a long time after the last reports came in. The wreckage of the Nexus cluster drifted outside, dimly lit by the dead stars of the system, pieces of a thing that had once threatened to empty the galaxy, now spinning slowly in the cold. She did not celebrate. No one on the ship celebrated, not at first. There was a stillness that settled over the crew for nearly an hour, everyone moving through post-engagement procedures quietly, checking systems, filing reports, accounting for their people. Thess found her there much later when the corridor had grown quiet and the sounds of the ship had settled into the low hum of recovery. He stood beside her at the viewport for a time without saying anything. Then he asked the question he had been holding since Saul. "Did you enjoy this?" he asked. He meant it without any accusation. After everything he had observed, he understood the question was not as simple as it sounded. She was quiet for a long time. "No," she said at last, "but we were ready for it. We have always been ready for it." She paused. "That is the thing about coming from a death world. You learn early that the universe does not care whether you survive, so you stop expecting kindness from it and you make very sure you can handle it when it shows you its worst." She looked at the drifting wreckage. "Beyond the glass, we did not want this war. We came because you asked us and because it was the right thing to do. But we were not surprised by it. We are never surprised by it." She turned to look at him. "That is not something to take pride in," she said, "but it is something to be honest about." Thess nodded slowly. He stood with her at the viewport for a while longer, both of them looking out at the quiet dark where something very old and very dangerous had finally gone still. 1 year later, the Vellery Grand Conclave convened in formal session on Vellery Prime. Among the items on the agenda was a motion filed by High Diplomat Saralana to update the official conclave registry classification for humanity. The original entry recorded 60 years prior read Terran origin. Classification primitive death world. Isolated status quarantined threat. Assessment minimal. The motion passed without a single dissenting vote. The new entry read Terran origin. Classification death world apex. Status ally note do not ask them to choose between patience and force. They are capable of remarkable patience. When that patience reaches its end, the force that follows is total. They will win the war, honor those they lost, and forgive those who asked it of them. But they will never forget what was asked or why it had to be them. The UTS, unyielding, left the Nexus system 12 hours after the last craft signal faded. Its hull was scarred and its crew was quiet, and its bow was turned toward Saul. Home.